Muchas gracias al señor presidente de México por su extraordinaria presentación. Quiero continuar con el programa que nos lleva al primer panel de empresarios. Deseo invitar al escenario en su orden al doctor Luis Carlos Villegas, presidente de la Asociación Nacional de Empresarios de Colombia, uno de los artífices de que estemos aquí en el día de hoy. Quiero también invitar al señor Richard Walk, presidente y CEO del Bank of Nova Scotia, una de las entidades financieras más importantes de Canadá. Asimismo, al señor José Antonio do Prado Fay, director ejecutivo de Brazil Foods, una de las compañías de alimentos más grandes del mundo. Y, por último, al señor José Antonio Fernández Carvajal, presidente del Consejo y director general de FEMSA, una empresa que cuenta con operaciones en 9 países de América Latina en el campo de las bebidas. Nuestro moderador en este panel va a ser John Paul Rathbone, editor para América Latina del diario el Financial Times, quien es autor del bestseller del New York Times, The Sugar King of Havana, The Rise and Fall of Julio Loa, Cuba's Last Tycoon. Mientras se despide el presidente, quiero invitarlos a tomar asiento para continuar con el programa. Tenemos una agenda bastante intensa. John Paul.
Bueno, gracias. No es muy común ahora escuchar un discurso tan apasionado en favor del libre comercio como hizo el señor presidente Calderón de México. Gracias. Estuvimos discutiendo en qué lengua nos vamos a hacer este panel, dado que hay un canadiense, uno mexicano, un colombiano y un brasilero aquí, y al fin decidimos hacerlo en inglés, aunque probablemente los panelistas van tal vez a contestar en su propia lengua. From the macroeconomic and the overarching view that we've had of the presidents, now we're going to get into a little bit of microeconomic nitty-gritty, and we're going to start with Richard Waugh from Scotiabank, going to talk about finance because it's something we all have in common and it's also a salient topic. Scotiabank just has invested $1 billion buying a Colombian assets here last year, and he's symptomatic. His bank is symptomatic of the problems that Europe and the United States have had in their financial systems. Have provided massive opportunities for domestic banks and also Canadian ones. But nonetheless, although the macroeconomic figures of the region are very strong, there are risks out there, and finance, more than anything perhaps, is a global industry, and liquidity, after all, flows from place to place. So, Richard, perhaps you could just talk a little bit about how safe is Latin America at the moment, given what's going on, especially in the Eurozone? And is there a risk of complacency, perhaps, in Latin America at the moment, given these budding, quiet at the moment, but still nonetheless budding financial problems?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. A little Canadian influence here, and I'm obviously a banker. I've got a shirt, a tie on, and a jacket, and I'm from Canada, so I'm always prepared for weather, but not like this. It's great. But the world is certainly a different place today than, say, has been over the last 30 or 40 years. I must say the 2 speeches we heard today, the 3 speeches, we wouldn't have heard in Latin America 30 to 40 years ago, before the LDC crisis, the tequila crisis, the Asian crisis, the Greek crisis today. And I think you wouldn't hear this in other parts of the world today, so it's quite extraordinary. And our bank has been very privileged, starting in the 1980s, to get down here and just recently in Colombia. But again, you're right, we can't be complacent. And the world is healing, but it's going to take a number of years before we get back to where we were before the 2008 and the Lehman crisis. And yes, I think Latin Americans did learn from the previous crisis. They learned you had to have strong stability in macroeconomic policies and supervision. And as we heard so dramatically this morning, you had to abandon protectionism, you had to open markets, trade, get governance, get transparency. And that's good, but those threats can always come back. And so I think, and you do hear rumblings, certainly in Europe and America and parts of Latin America, of somewhat going back. Protectionism, floating currency rates, let the currency be flexible and work. It promotes productivity. The days of massive devaluations caused lots of problems in the past. We have to watch, because growth is going to be slower, because there's been huge amounts of deleveraging that have come out because of the recent crisis with banks. That deleveraging, which was absolutely necessary, the deleveraging of the banking system and the non-banking system, and as we saw, the interconnectivity, the leaders at the G20s have said to the regulators, including Latin American ones, make sure that crisis doesn't happen again. So there's this huge amount of deleveraging going on, and it will affect you here in Latin America. And it is not just the leveraging, but it's the funding and the liquidity and the amount of supervision. And in Latin America, the banking system is very, very important because the capital markets have yet to develop. So we have to watch to find the balance, because, as this graph shows, when you do it the right way, it does create growth and it creates jobs. But there are a lot of forces right now that are working against that. And as you heard by the leader today, and I imagine some of the other leaders, that is the right message. Let the capital has to be there, funding has to be there, but keep your markets open, keep your tariffs down, let your interest rates float, because I think there'll be a world of opportunity as you're seeing. But there are those measures that are going to affect growth, and you're seeing it in the United States and you're seeing it in Europe, and I think that's the big risk that I see. Just two other risks, because banks are so important in all countries, certainly my country, Canada, and what have you. But the banking system, love us or hate us, we do provide credit. And those banks that do provide credit the right way, who have the right risk management, who look at risk in the way of managing your assets, managing your funding, that can create great opportunities. And I think that has to be focused on here, because the importance of the banking system, you can't have it weaken as much the Americans and the Europeans have, because these great things that are going on, there'll be shocks to the system.
Richard, just very briefly, to the extent that international capital markets are less important for Latin America and traditional bank lending is more important, what would be the transmission mechanism of, say, a massive liquidity shock emanating from the Eurozone to, say, small to medium business lending in Latin America via a bank channel? What would be the transmission mechanism there?
Well, we saw through, don't forget even the Asian crisis when Thailand, had its crisis, and then of course we saw the interconnectivity. There is only a certain amount of capital in the world, and if it's starting to be taken away, it will affect the whole international trade. I think, though, because of the demographics of Latin America, because of the age of 27, the domestic consumption, it can be mitigated. It will still affect the growth, but it won't be like Greece, where they had a single currency. And again, when that happens and you have no central bank, you had a huge interconnectedness. I think again, not to be complacent, there are enough diversification of markets here, both domestically and within the region, that if it doesn't overreact with protectionism and foreign exchange controls, I'm an optimist, and I think that can be managed.
So cautiously optimistic, I think, is the bottom line on that.
Always be cautiously optimistic.
From finance, one of the most globalized industry in the world, to agriculture and food, traditionally one of the most protected. We've got Jose Antonio do Prado Fey from Brazil Foods, one of the largest food exporters, and especially beef exporters in the world. And you deal with protectionism every day. It's sort of your bread and butter, even though your biggest market is the Middle East. Again, a very interesting place for a multi-Latina to be exporting into such a region which is so unstable at the moment. Tell us about a little bit of Brazil Foods' experience of protectionism and how you have managed to get around that.
Okay. Food have many particular aspects regarding to protectionism. Food is very strategic. Every country protects its capacity to produce food, trying to protect the supply, guarantee the supply. And many aspects are created on this issue. It's very strategic to produce food, but more strategic is to feed people. And many countries have many difficulties in producing food and protect its industry very strongly. The aspects that the food demand, it's increasing dramatically. Population is urbanizing. The consumers are getting more purchasing power, coming from, in our case, the cheapest protein, it's egg protein. And then the consumers move to ready-to-eat dishes, demanding a lot of energy, a lot of technology, and so on. And there is too the religious and cultural aspects. For instance, Middle East, halal production. In India, they avoid to eat red meat and so on. So when we look for trade barriers in food, we are responsible for 20% of total chicken trade, food protein trade in the world, and we answer to 9% of total protein global trade, and this is only 10% of total consumption, which means that 90% of food consumption is locally produced. For the aspect that I told before, but for many barriers that it's imposed by the industries and the governments to food. But we have to look at that very carefully, because when we protect the wrong side of food production, when we protect a wrong labor capital relationship, when we protect difficulties in access to water, to energy, and when we waste water to produce that, we are preparing a heavy bill to pay in the future. So we deal with more than 100 countries, and we have many barriers to pass, sanitary barriers, commercial barriers, tax barriers. But at the end of the day, we believe that we should look for, at the beginning, not for free trade agreements, because this is the second step. The first step would be to find the fair trade agreements for food, which means that the local production together with import from raw material or from ready-to-eat dishes. So the next step for the food industry, it's to find globally these fair trade agreements, to set the barriers at the right point.
And what would you say is a right point? Does it depend on each market, or does it depend where it's starting from?
It's much dependable from the market, and we have to make the mea culpa too in this. Sometimes we industries are asking for protection for the governments, and sometimes we are today in food, Latin America, and mostly the Americas in general, but specifically Latin America, we are hitting the barrier, trying to get into, but sometimes we are in the other side trying to deal with our main and our own problems, hidden costs, lack of education, lack of labor force, and so on.
Does the let's call it defensiveness in Brazil rather than protection of its manufacturing sector, has that made your life harder in the agricultural sector in terms of market access?
Yes, because there is a
double
two
discourse.
ways. Yes, it's a two ways. Because for us, when we look for Asia, for China, it's a huge opportunity for food producers. Because China have a lot of problems to produce food. They have shortage in water. They do not have enough land to produce grains and so on. But when the countries protect the manufacturing from China, China answers protecting its food market from the main producers as Americas are. So this is a two-way via.
Okay, we're going to come back to this theme because it's so relevant now. By pure coincidence, we have another Jose Antonio here, Jose Antonio Fernandez, also born on the same year as the other Jose Antonio and also works in food, but for the Mexican multilatina FEMSA, which used to be involved in beer, but then sold its beer businesses to Heineken. I think it's merged. Don't you have a 20% stake in Heineken now? Is that right? And but still in the bottling business, and very much a multilatina. Tell us a little bit about what being a multilatina has meant to you in terms of moving into other markets, be that in Latin America or those abroad, such as the Far East, as you're thinking about going to the Philippines, and also what expanding abroad has allowed you to bring back to Mexico and to FEMSA.
Great. Thank you. Well, we started in Latin America, going out of Mexico in '94, going to Argentina first with a bottling company, Coca-Cola bottling company in Argentina, and then about 12 years ago we went to other 7 countries in Latin America, so now we are in 9 countries in Latin America. We started only going with Coca-Cola. We learned a lot of how to adapt to each culture. Latin America obviously is a multicultural region. Coming to Argentina is very different than going to Brazil or coming to Colombia. We learned that we have to adapt to each market, even selling Coca-Cola.
Even though Coca-Cola is it's a uniform product and it's consumed in the same way.
The flavor and the formula obviously is the same, but the way to sell it and the kind of SKUs that you have to use, the sizes, the distribution that we have to channels are totally different in different countries. Argentina or Brazil has maybe 55% of big supermarkets where we sell Coca-Cola, and some other countries in Central America or Mexico where the great majority is on mom and pops. So it's a very different way of selling the same product.
So it's distribution is really what's been most different in each country.
Yes. Distribution and flexibility. What we learned is that we had to create, even in Mexico, a much larger portfolio of SKUs for the same product. And that has been a huge difference. If you go to, maybe in the United States, you find very few SKUs to sell Coca-Cola. You find a can, 2 or 3 bottle sizes, 1 in glass and 2 or 2 in PET. In Mexico, we may have, or in Latin America, we may have maybe 18 to 25 different SKUs just for Coca-Cola. So price points of Coca-Cola are very important. You can buy a Coca-Cola in most of our countries in Latin America from 4 pesos, equivalent in Mexican pesos, to 20 pesos. 5, 6, 7, you can find either returnable bottle, non-returnable bottle, can, glass, anything. And we have been able to compete with low price or high price depending on which channel. What we don't allow is to have these products mix in every channel. So the 3 liter, you won't find it in a restaurant. You will find it in a very low price supermarket, for instance. And that has been a process learning that we have been able to exchange from one country to another.
So the way you approach a problem in each country allows you to think about the way you would approach a problem in another country.
Yes. Now, another very important cultural issue for us has been how to bring all those capabilities from Argentina, where we learned a lot, or from Colombia or from Brazil, to Mexico and all the way around. So first we tried to just get together with the Brazilians or the Colombians and learn from each other. We discovered that that's not the way of exchanging practices. We had to exchange executives. So we started what we call a big working cell, where an expert in Brazil of doing any capability comes to Mexico to live for 3 to 6 months and teach all of the other, let's say, warehouse managers of Mexico how they do it in Brazil. He is working there, he's the boss for 6 months, teaches all of them, and then he returns to his country.
That makes, I mean, this is very much how Saab Miller operates. The
I don't
British-based,
know those guys.
It's a British-based brewer, but it works just the same,
Yes,
which makes me wonder, is there any difference really between a multinational and a multi-Latina in that there's bound to be convergence of best practices?
Yes. You have to act very local, but think very global.
Adding on that, because we feel the same, because we distribute in Latin America, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, and in Southeast Asia. I think that this is one of the strengths of the Latin America companies, because we learn in our countries, the people that like me are over 50s here know how hard was life here in the last 20 of the 30 years. So we have to find ways to keep on making money to defend ourselves from inflation. So this is one thing that I think that it's a strengthness of the Latin companies, know how to deal with different environments and hostile environments.
Is it better to say, rather than learning how to deal with different environments, you learn how to deal with difficult environments?
Yes.
Is that an expertise that you can use to penetrate developed markets as well? Presumably it's a very different game.
Yes, we played this kind of game in Holland, and we have a factory in Holland and in England. It's totally different. Really, we played a B2B game because we are not able to pass the retailer barriers in Europe. It's hard to make money. It's so concentrated retailer structure that it exists in Europe. So then we find another way to go, because it's hard to face as European companies does, and they lose a lot of money, and normally they are shrinking their food industry due to this strong pressure that they felt from retailers.
Great. Now, of course, we're in Colombia. We cannot have a conversation in Colombia without talking specifically about Colombia. So we've got Dr. Luis Carlos Villegas here. And for someone myself, I've been coming to Colombia for 25 years, and it's very heartening to see the progress and change that has happened here. But as President Santos was saying earlier,
importantes, que es la gobernabilidad. Y pensé en la virtud de la seguridad del presidente Uribe, y pensé en la virtud de la derrota política del terrorismo del presidente Pastrana, y de la virtud de la apertura comercial del presidente Gaviria al principio de los 90. se me vino a la mente inmediatamente la relación entre cada uno de esos asuntos y la decisión que tomó Colombia desde la política y desde las empresas de participar plenamente en la globalización. Lo que ha pasado en Colombia básicamente es que tomamos la decisión como país de participar plenamente del nuevo mundo conectado que estaba allí.
Pero
Eso-
¿cómo llegó este momento de participar como un país? Porque ese es un problema en otros países que hay distintos sectores que tienen distintas ideas y lo que tal vez diferencia a Colombia es que hubo un sentido de tenemos que hacer algo junto para llegar junto.
Así es, llevamos 14 años de un solo rumbo en materia económica y que básicamente lo que tiende es a conectar a Colombia con las grandes corrientes de pensamiento y de economía. Y eso ha causado, yo diría, al menos 7 efectos. El primero es haber movido nuestra tasa de crecimiento económico de alrededor de 3,5% anual a más del 5% anual, promedio. En segundo lugar, haber pasado nuestro tamaño económico de 100.000 millones de dólares hace 10 años a algo más de 330.000 millones de dólares, con las consecuencias que eso tiene sobre el ingreso per cápita y la capacidad de consumo. Pasamos de $2.000 por colombiano a este 2012, $8.000 por colombiano. En tercer lugar, hicimos todo un esfuerzo de estabilidad macroeconómica que es necesaria en la globalización, tanto en inflación como en los distintos temas que se manejan desde el gobierno, desde el Banco Central. Igualmente, hicimos una apertura que me parece bien hecha, tenemos más de una docena de tratados comerciales que están funcionando, otros 4 que se están negociando, y eso ha generado una gran posibilidad de crecimiento en las empresas, tanto en las exportaciones de bienes terminados como en las importaciones de bienes intermedios de capital y materias primas. Hemos multiplicado nuestras ventas al exterior casi por 4 veces en apenas 10 años. Igualmente hemos llegado a la frontera asiática, diría yo, de tener de $100 de nuestra economía, 30 dedicados a la inversión. Ese es un esfuerzo sin antecedentes en Colombia. 30% del PIB es hoy la participación de la inversión y eso nos va a garantizar crecimientos futuros también muy grandes. Y por último, lo que más importante ha sucedido es las consecuencias en lo social. Colombia es un país que no cuenta debidamente la historia exitosísima de redención de pobreza que ha vivido en los últimos 10, 12 años. Hace 12 años las tasas de pobreza en Colombia eran del 60%, 6 de cada 10 colombianos estaban por debajo de la línea de pobreza. Hoy son 3 de cada 10. Eso quiere decir que hemos puesto en la clase media desde la pobreza cerca de 9 millones de personas en 10 años. Proporcionalmente eso es un esfuerzo tan grande o más grande que el que ha hecho Brasil o que el que ha hecho la propia China. Entonces, esa es una consecuencia que hace que la globalización colombiana haya llevado a una buena economía y a unos avances muy grandes en lo social que estamos seguros se van a repetir en los próximos 10 años también de una manera muy notoria.
Un punto que me interesa es cómo llega el consenso dentro del país de abrirse hacia el mundo, dado que hace 30 años López Michelson dijo esto es el Tíbet de América del Sur. Entonces, y para usted, trabajando en el campo empresarial, ¿era una lucha de convencer sectores de la población que el mercado libre, el comercio libre es una buena idea? ¿O era de un día al otro diciendo, nos vamos en este rumbo?
Sin duda, y las instituciones del sector privado también tuvimos ese debate por dentro. Era una posición bastante clara la que había hace 20 años de no permitir por ninguna razón la modernización o la apertura en materia de comercio exterior. Hoy yo creo que hay un consenso bastante amplio sobre la necesidad de ampliar nuestros horizontes de comercio exterior. Por ejemplo, los aranceles promedio de este país eran hace 3 años 12%. Hoy son 5.3% los aranceles promedio. Y eso hace 20 años hubiera generado una malestar empresarial inmensamente grande, que hoy, con los cuidados que se han tenido, me parece que ha sido aceptado con un consenso bastante favorable.
Ok. Bueno, moviendo del particular hacia el general, lo que ha distinguido los últimos 10 años ha sido la subida de China, que ha sido un reto para algunos y una oportunidad para otros. Richard, China, for you, or in the financial world at least, has been an alternative source of finance in Latin America, obviously a very particular kind of source of finance, but there's also been some commercial bank lending. And I just wondered from a financial perspective, because usually the rise of China is seen as a manufacturing threat. Is China a competitor? Do you see China and provision of Chinese finance as a competitor in Latin America for your business?
No. We've got several branches in China, and we own 20% of 2 or 3 Chinese banks. It's a different, the world is interconnected, and so for us, China has got other issues that they have to sort, which they are sorting out, as transparency and those other issues. And the Chinese have to work themselves through there, and there is a risk that that may not happen. We lend money, so we have to be very diversified. So China for us is our R&D. We're not committing, and we're not committing our bank to China, but we are investing in China. So to me, any global business, there are geopolitical risks and there are local risks, and the only way that I know how to compete in that way, and we're highly leveraged, we're more leveraged than our customers, is you be very diversified. And you be very diversified. So China for us is diversification. For your various businesses, I think you have to be there. And if you sell food or toothpaste or whatever, or bottling, it's a great market to be. But as great as so many Latin American countries are, we don't risk our bank on any one particular country because things change. I think the outlook for Latin America, most of Latin America, is very, very good. And we still hold our Brazilian LDC bonds, which we got in 1985. One bank who chose not to sell them, we wrote them down, and they're giving us a very good yield. But LDC reminded me, and we went through the Asian crisis. We're the 3rd largest bank in Thailand right now, but we stay diversified, and that's what we have to watch.
The theme of this panel is about disaggregation of the manufacturing chain, be that of goods or finance, and in your Latin American operations, presuming that they're locally funded and augmented by international finance, but what's the mix there?
Well, I think it is a good point, because as I heard, about the food business and the distribution business, one of the risks I think that Latin America has to watch is your customers are earning pesos or soles. They're paying their taxes in a local currency. And yet, especially the large companies are attracted by cheap US dollar rates. And I have seen time and time again when the currencies move in opposite directions, great companies get into very big problems. And I think Latin American companies, as they become more and more global, searching out markets in China, whatever, you have to fund locally. I mean, some of the very biggest companies can fund in the euro markets and the US dollars, but look what happened in 2008. When those markets dried up, the ones that survived, whether it be banks or whatever, had local funding in local currencies, fund in how you get paid by your customers.
The two Jose Antonios, is this how you function? When you're in Latin America, do you fund your Argentine operations in Argentina? If you were to go into the Philippines, would you fund your Philippine operations in the Philippines? How do you manage your capital in that sense?
We try to use as much finance local everywhere. One of the learning things that I mentioned to adapt, of adapting, perdón, voy a hablar en español, creo que es más fácil para todos. Se me olvida cuando me preguntan en inglés, me parece que tengo que contestar en inglés, pero estamos en Colombia. Adaptarnos a cada país nos ha permitido entender que tenemos que comprar lo más posible en cada país, consumir, tener la mayor gente de ese país. En la mayoría de las operaciones que tenemos de varias nacionalidades, pero no todos son mexicanos, es más, muy poquitos mexicanos. En Argentina tenemos un colombiano que maneja, en Brasil tuvimos un argentino, aquí ahora lo maneja un mexicano que estuvo antes en Venezuela, tengo muchos venezolanos en México, etcétera. Intercambiamos mucho a la gente y aprendemos a tratarnos de adaptar mucho más a cada región. Lo que aprendimos aquí ahora lo queremos llevar a Filipinas. Creemos que mucho de lo que hemos vivido en estos años en Colombia, nos acordamos cuando teníamos que salir a preguntar por dónde podíamos llevar nuestros productos, porque había rutas que ayer estaban abiertas y hoy estaban cerradas. La verdad era muy divertido, había mucha adrenalina en el trabajo y en el negocio. Eso ha cambiado muchísimo, empieza hasta a hacerse un poco aburrido, gracias a Dios, pero nos ha ido muy bien en Colombia desde entonces. La evolución del país ha sido impactante, impresionante. Y lo que hemos visto es que todo este aprendizaje, estos que se empiezan a aburrir ahora quieren ir a Filipinas y empezar a hacer cosas nuevas, llevar mucho conocimiento de lo mismo que hemos aprendido aquí, de cómo dar vuelta en algunos mercados que estaban mal.
Tenemos gráficos atrás escribiendo el nivel de intercomercio dentro de una región, pero yo tengo la impresión de su negocio que pertenece muchísimo a cada país, es muy local y no hay tantos componentes que se puede compartir.
Así es. Nosotros prácticamente no tenemos intercambio entre países ni de exportación. Ahora lo que hacemos es llevar más insumos. En Colombia tenemos ya una fábrica de enfriadores para refrescos, para sodas. Tenemos servicios de logística, una compañía grande ya de servicios de logística en Brasil, en Colombia, en Costa Rica, porque son los insumos estratégicos que requerimos tener detrás de nuestras operaciones.
Entonces la idea de fragmentar la cadena puede ser verdad por unas industrias, pero no por todos.
No para todos, no para todos definitivamente.
Y especialmente para usted, José Antonio, voy a cambiar en inglés otra vez. You have a very vertically integrated business from the chick, the pollito, hacia el gallo, from the baby calf to the finished meat product. To what extent, and also, although it's agriculture, the value added from that should be added. It's immense, because it's strange to think of a cow or a chicken as a factory, but in a sense it is turning sunshine and food into something that has got added value. But to what extent is all of this based in Brazil, and then you export the manufactured product? And also, to what extent do you finance your operations locally depending on the export market, or is it all very much in Brazil?
Okay. No voy a cambiar para español, porque si cambio, ustedes van a sufrir y los traductores se quedarán locos. Estoy estudiando, pero aún hablo en español muy bárbaro, muy bárbaro. No como los argentinos hablan bárbaro, pero en el término radical, bárbaro porque no es civilizado. de cualquier forma. So, turning to the point, I think that two questions regarding to how we hedge our business. We have about $5.5 billion in net sales every year, and we have about 20% of our costs dollar related. Then we have the natural hedge, which is the best protection that we can have. And when we deal with we deal mainly in dollars, and when we go in internal markets, we have to pay a lot of attention on that. And regarding to the culture, I used to say that we are a big food exporter, and until 5 years ago, the second biggest exporter that we did was Brazilians. We export a lot of Brazilians. It is not good for the business, really not. We are now trying to put local people in local operations much better. Of course, keeping the same process, but using local labor and local people. Regarding to the best model that we can reach, it's to pick up raw material from Brazil, which is a cheap source of raw material, protein basically, and process it locally. So the structures that we have outside Brazil, the factories are to process the food, because we are branded and processed food. We do not like to sell in natura meat because it's very hard to add value in natura meat. So when you go and process it locally, we are closer of consumers, we are able to reach distribution better, and so on. When we can't do that, we go from Brazil to the shelves. But it's harder to do, harder than harder. In time, it's going worse and worse to doing that. We only produce the protein, the animal, in Brazil and in Argentina, which is one of the best places in the world to produce. Brazil, US, and Argentina are the best places to produce protein, and this is our, let's say, raw material producing. But to process, it's much better to process it local.
Process locally.
Pardon?
To process the food locally.
Yes, process as we do in Europe, in Argentina, and so we are closer from the consumers. We can develop better products to them and branding it better.
I think we're hearing a very important point here that everybody has made. It's an old saying, I think many have heard of it, is think globally but act locally. And whether it's the size of your bottles or all the food issues that you have locally, it's so important. We've been in some countries for 100 years, and to find that balance of act locally but think globally, you want the economies of scale that one can get, so IT, issues, purchasing power, all these things, your human resources. If you can have global managers but who can adapt to different cultures, that is a very, very hard thing to do. The great multinational, I think it's a better word than global in many respects, companies can do that. And it's a very hard thing to do, but those that do that are going to be able to thrive. I was in Atlanta just recently and met the CEO of Coca-Cola, and we talked about the Arab Spring, what was going on in the Middle East. And I asked him, how did you survive that? And he said, we did have no problems at all. Here's Coca-Cola, a great American brand. And he says, why? They think of us as a local company.
Yes.
They think of, there's Coca-Cola, which is American imperialism or whatever you want to call it, but they were thought locally. And I think that was a great comment. I think that's what everybody's been saying.
And is that the same, you're nodding, is that the same experience for Brazil Foods during the Arab Spring and in Russia as well, a very difficult market?
Yes, we have different approach. For instance, in Egypt, we suffered a lot because we couldn't keep our export level to Egypt, since Egypt really collapsed its international trade. In the Gulf area and in Saudi Arabia, it's one of the main markets that we operate. And in Saudi Arabia, we have a very particular and fortunately point. Our brand there is Sadia. What they think that is Saudi, and they consider Sadia as a local brand. Although we do not produce in Saudi Arabia, we produce something in the Gulf area. So when we have this national taste, it's much, much better, and it's much easier to pass the barriers than when we come with the ready-to-eat products.
Staying with exotic markets, one of Brazil Foods' markets is Iran. And I mean, how have you managed that lately with the sanctions? And has the business fallen? Is it flat? Has it gone up?
Iran is very difficult today. Nowadays, it's very difficult. Not only because we have problems logistic problems to operate Iran, but according to financial, it's very hard to collect the money from Iran because due to this banning that the U.S. made, the banks could not operate with Iranian to collect money, it's very hard. But Iran needs a lot of food, and sometimes it opens the market, sometimes it closes. But at this right moment, Iran and Iraq and Egypt are three countries that are not so easy to. The Arab Spring, it's hitting us in these three countries.
How do you plan for such markets? Because you're dealing in produce that it keeps growing and you can't.
Yes.
So how do you plan ahead to a market that's going to open and shut and then maybe pay and maybe won't pay? What mindset do you use and what practical?
Yes, this is the biggest challenge that we face, because as we have a long cycle business, the total cycle of a chicken, for instance, we came from the grandmother of the chick, which means that it's 600 days to have one chick more. So we have to plan in very, very advanced way. And then we have to move inventories to another places. Today we are moving, for instance, for Libya. Libya, after the revolution, Libya is buying a lot. We moved something to Africa, but we have to move the flows, because we could not stop the flows. If we produce we slaughter 7 million birds a day. And then, which means that we have more than 200 million birds alive. And every day it's born 7 million, and every day we slaughter 7 million. So it's a very pull chain and not so pushed for the market. So we have to move inventories when it happens.
Well, that gives a whole new perspective on supply chain management that I'd never really thought of before. Changing the subject, let's move on to an unfortunate skill, una especialidad que da una pena a la región de América Latina, que es seguridad, porque América Latina, esta región, es un campeón en dos cosas, que es desigualdad y desafortunadamente inseguridad. Y cómo se lo maneja en sus propias empresas, como empresarios, los niveles de inseguridad, aunque sí están mejorando. Y hay algunas lecciones, tal vez por las otras partes del mundo. Vamos a empezar con Dr. Villegas y el caso de Colombia.
Sí, Colombia hace 15 años era un país que estaba, como lo mencionaba el presidente Santos, muy cerca de su disolución. Y hoy puede exhibir en distintos temas, entre ellos seguridad, unos avances reconocidos no solo por los colombianos, sino desde fuera. Y me refiero antes de seguridad a otros aspectos. Por ejemplo, política exterior. Colombia era un país aislado, desertificado, muy cercano al embargo comercial y realmente un país con el cual ningún otro Estado quería tener una profundización de relación política o comercial. Hoy, como lo describe muy gráficamente Luis Alberto Moreno, Colombia es la bisagra entre el norte y el sur del continente americano. Eso hace un gran cambio. Segundo lugar, en seguridad. Hemos dado un gran salto a la seguridad ciudadana desde la seguridad del terrorismo que nos azotó durante muchos años. Esta era una democracia que tenía todas las amenazas posibles que puede tener una democracia en sus puertas. Era una amenaza de seguridad, de crimen organizado, de terrorismo, de corrupción, de inclusive conflictos internacionales. Esa seguridad ha llegado por varias razones. Una, porque se ha hecho una reforma institucional de la fuerza pública a profundidad. Dos, porque el sector privado ha reconocido la seguridad como un problema suyo y ha puesto los recursos, abundantemente los recursos, para poder financiar esa modernización de la fuerza pública y esa modernización de ciertos capítulos de la justicia. En tercer lugar, porque ha habido cooperación internacional generosa y muy pertinente, y encabezo la lista con el Plan Colombia de los Estados Unidos. Sin duda prestó en Colombia un servicio de fortalecimiento democrático muy, muy importante en nuestra historia. Y por último, la seguridad hoy en Colombia no es una discusión ideológica, es un valor. No hay partido político, no hay institución pública o privada que no considere que una vez ganados altos niveles de seguridad, allí nos debemos mantener. Y cada vez que alguien opina diciendo que estamos con unos niveles de seguridad que puede que se estén deteriorando, toda la sociedad se preocupa y al mismo tiempo se ocupa de que se mantengan esos niveles altos. Entonces se interiorizó como un valor social que yo creo que es muy difícil poder desmontar rápidamente. Y por último, pues Colombia de ese momento de país en disolución, hoy es una potencia regional de primer orden en todos los aspectos. Y eso los colombianos lo tenemos que cuidar desde la política y lo tenemos que cuidar desde lo empresarial. Eso significa mantener el rumbo en los avances sociales, eso significa mantener la profundización de las reformas en justicia, en tributación, en equidad, mantener los programas de responsabilidad social de las empresas. Pero este país ha podido avanzar en apenas una década y media, muchísimo más que lo que había hecho en tal vez 2 siglos de existencia independiente.
Así es, así es. En México, especialmente con un negocio como FEMSA, que tiene supuestamente un centro financiero y industrial, pero también que tiene distribución. Entonces, ustedes tienen que enfrentar probablemente en estados donde hay mucha inseguridad, cómo lo maneja, dado que probablemente sus distribuidores son efectivamente negocios pequeños o gente que tiene su camión con botellas de gaseosas.
América Latina en general es un país complicado en temas de inseguridad. En la mayoría de los países que estamos hay problemas de inseguridad, niveles que suben y bajan. Gracias a Dios, por ejemplo, aquí en Colombia, como bien dicen, está bajando y ha bajado muchísimo, en otros ha subido, y en todos tenemos ya, pues ahora sí que aprendizajes de uno y otro lado. Nosotros nos hemos convencido de que, como también mencionaron ahorita, las empresas tenemos que tomar este problema como propio, trabajar mucho en él.
¿En qué sentido? ¿Cómo, en términos prácticos?
Mira,
¿cómo lo
desde
manejan?
instruir a toda nuestra gente de cómo comportarse, cómo cuidarse, cómo actuar cuando les toca algún asalto, chantaje o algún incidente de inseguridad. Antes no estábamos, la verdad, nadie preparado. Hemos aprendido mucho porque aquí en Colombia lo vivimos hace 15 años, hace 14 años, y nos hemos llevado tecnología de proceso en ese sentido. Hemos aprendido que no caemos en el chantaje, no podemos romper ninguna regla, no podemos dar dinero porque das la primera vez y la das para siempre. Eso ha sido muy relevante. Y nos ha caído, como decimos en México, el 20 a cambiar y evolucionar, a que las empresas, sobre todo en América Latina, tenemos una obligación social muy grande. Nosotros cambiamos hace unos 6 años nuestra misión de largo plazo a una misión que dice que nosotros buscamos generar valor económico y social a través de empresas e instituciones. Y estamos invirtiendo a doble dígito cada vez más en temas de valor social, de cultura de la legalidad, de ciudadanía, de educación y de cuidado ambiental en todos lados donde estamos. Lo que nos hemos dado cuenta es que hasta las mafias respetan más a las empresas que se pronuncian por el valor social que a las que no. Entonces, si me dices, lo haces por filántropo, lo hago porque es negocio, generar valor social.
Otro ejemplo del valor del negocio social, del trabajo social. Pero ustedes todos vienen de empresas muy grandes y pueden enfrentar estos tipos de costos y gastos, y también los gastos ¿cómo puedo decir?, de los trámites y
Sí.
también de inseguridad jurídica. Pero siempre se da la impresión que son las pequeñas empresas.
Sí.
Ellos no pueden enfrentarlo y ellos son las víctimas por la mayoría.
Solos no pueden, pero unidos en las cámaras, en las asociaciones, incluso unidos con las cadenas comerciales. ¿Qué quiere decir? Nosotros ayudamos y apoyamos a todos nuestros proveedores y a muchos clientes. Y tenemos reuniones con ellos en donde compartimos todo el conocimiento que tenemos, se los damos a ellos, porque pues son parte de nuestra cadena productiva y queremos que estén igual de seguros que todas las empresas. Entonces, poco a poco y educando, suena un poco presuntuoso, pero ayudando a que aprendan lo que ya vivimos en otros países, nos ha servido muchísimo para que se unan. Las cámaras son cruciales. Yo nunca entendía por qué en algunas otras épocas un director de la compañía de hace muchos años, don Eugenio Garzazada, que falleció en un intento de secuestro en los 70, él fomentaba mucho la asociación de todo, clubes para todo, grupos de interés, empresas que se asociaran en cámaras, etcétera. Y es para esto, para fortalecer a las pequeñas y medianas que son al final
los que emplean más, ¿no?
Así es.
Esa ha sido la experiencia en Colombia, la irrigación la práctica mejor de empresas grandes hacia los más pequeños, y que las empresas más grandes abren un brecha, no sé, en términos de mejor maneras de enfrentar inseguridad, lo que sea jurídica o criminal.
Sí, sin duda el concepto de encadenamiento no termina solamente en lo que es proveeduría de tus proveedores hacia arriba o de tus clientes hacia abajo. Tiene que incluir también temas como la responsabilidad social y la seguridad. Y eso se hace en encadenamientos cada vez más frecuentes entre grandes empresas y pequeñas y medianas. Y la otra cuestión es que las empresas pequeñas y medianas entran más bien dentro de la categoría de seguridad ciudadana, es decir, la seguridad que provee el Estado porque ha mejorado la calidad institucional y la capacidad de actuar contra el delito o contra la inseguridad en general. No se le puede pedir a las empresas pequeñas y medianas que tengan sus propios mecanismos de seguridad. Tiene que haber encadenamiento y un mejor contexto institucional estatal de seguridad ciudadana.
Richard, the last question for you. Canada, not known for being a very unsafe place, in fact, on the contrary, a very safe place. How do you view coming to Latin America?
Well, we are in 55 countries, and we've been in many of them for over 100 years, Latin America and others. We have a very special role because we have to look after the savings of our customers. We talk about risk management, but we have your savings. We have your savings account, we have your payments account, and we have all your privacy, your financial information. So we spend a lot of time. If you look at the percentage of expenses we pay on protecting our customers, it's one of my major priorities. And because it is, I won't go into a lot of details, because once we tell you how we do it,
and anyway, it's time for lunch.
But let me just one thing: the bank robberies and ransoms are very, very serious, and you have to do things in that. But cyber fraud, probably one of the major security items in my industry, and it affects everybody here. And the number of people that we have working daily, 7/24, on cyber fraud, the payment account is huge. One of the biggest issues facing the banking system in the world, once we get this risk management, the capital and liquidity, is the payment system. And how do we protect it? Because we're protecting our customer savings. And there is today huge amounts of illegal money being devoted to that, and we have to combat that. And it's a big, big issue that faces us all. And the physical is important because it's your life, but it's also the payments.
Como casi todo en el mundo es más dematerializado cada día. Entonces quiero que ustedes dan gracias a nuestro panel, y ahora es un tiempo para almorzar.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.